Sarah lived on a small farm way out in the dusty plains. Her house was made of wood, and the roof was strong, but the land was hard to work. She woke up every morning to the sound of birds and the hot sun. But being alone on the farm made her feel small and scared. Her husband, Jed, was supposed to help her, but Jed was often gone. He said he was working, but Sarah knew better. People whispered that Jed was an outlaw, a bad man who robbed stagecoaches. Sarah didn't want to believe it, but she had seen the way people looked at him, with fear and anger. She tried to make the best of it. She planted corn and beans. She took care of the chickens and the cow. She hoped that one day Jed would change, that he would stay home and help her build a good life. Sometimes Jed would bring her presents, a pretty ribbon for her hair or a shiny stone he found by the river. He would tell her he loved her, and she would almost believe him. But then he would leave again, disappearing into the night. One day, Jed left and didn't come back. Sarah waited and waited. She looked for him every day, hoping to see him riding over the hill. But he was gone. It was like he had vanished into thin air. She was all alone, with only the chickens and the cow for company. She missed Jed, even though he was an outlaw. She missed his smile and his stories. She hoped he was safe wherever he was. Little did she know, being alone was only the start of her troubles. The whispers about Jed being an outlaw followed Sarah like a shadow. When she went to town for supplies, people would stare. Some would turn away, their faces tight with disapproval. Others would mutter under their breath, calling Jed names she didn't want to repeat. Sarah tried to ignore them, but it was hard. The fear in their eyes was like a cold wind, chilling her to the bone. One day, Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, refused to sell Sarah bread. "I won't support the wife of a thief," she said, her voice sharp. Sarah's face burned with shame. She left the bakery without a word, her stomach empty. Even the children in town seemed to know. They would point and whisper, "That's the outlaw's wife." Sarah felt like she was wearing a sign that said, "My husband is a bad man." She longed to tell them Jed wasn't all bad, that he could be kind and funny, but she knew they wouldn't believe her. The truth was, Sarah lived in fear too. She worried about Jed getting caught. She worried about him getting hurt. And she worried about what would happen to her if he was gone. The other women in town had husbands who were farmers and shopkeepers. They had families and friends. Sarah had only Jed, and even he was more like a ghost than a husband. She tried to talk to Jed about it once. "The people in town, they don't like me," she said, her voice trembling. Jed just laughed. "Let them talk," he said. "What do we care what they think?" But Sarah cared. She wanted to be accepted. She wanted to be part of the community. But as long as Jed was an outlaw, she knew she never would be. One evening, Jed came home looking different. He wasn't his usual boisterous self. He was quiet, almost sad. He sat Sarah down at the kitchen table, his hand covering hers. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "I'm done with it. I'm done with being an outlaw." Sarah's heart leaped. "What do you mean, Jed?" she asked, barely daring to breathe. "I mean, I'm finished," he said. "No more robbing. No more running. I'm going to be a good man. For you." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it was here, she was afraid to believe it. "Can you really change, Jed?" she asked. "I can," he said, his eyes looking right into hers. "I will. Just give me a chance." He told her he was going to sell his guns and his horse. He was going to find honest work. He promised her they would start a new life, a life where she didn't have to be ashamed. Sarah wanted to believe him so badly. She looked into his eyes and saw a flicker of hope. "Okay, Jed," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll give you a chance." For a few weeks, things were good. Jed helped her with the farm work. He fixed the fence and mended the roof. He even went to town with her, and although people still stared, he held his head high. Sarah started to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to be okay. They laughed together. They worked together. Sarah felt happier than she had in a long time. But deep down, a small part of her was still scared. She knew that changing wasn't easy, especially for someone like Jed. And she worried that his past would always come back to haunt them. The disappearance happened on a Tuesday. Jed woke up early, before the sun. He told Sarah he was going into town to sell some of the lumber he had chopped. He kissed her goodbye, a quick, fleeting kiss, and promised to be back before dark. Sarah watched him ride away, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. As the day wore on, Sarah tried to stay busy. She weeded the garden, fed the chickens, and mended a tear in her dress. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but Jed still hadn't returned. Sarah lit a lamp and sat on the porch, waiting. The crickets chirped, and the wind rustled through the trees. Still, no sign of Jed. As the hours passed, Sarah's worry turned to fear. Had something happened to him? Had his old life caught up with him? Finally, when the moon was high in the sky, Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her shawl and went to the barn. She saddled up her old mare, Bess, and started riding toward town. The road was dark and lonely, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When Sarah arrived in town, it was deserted. The saloons were closed, and the streets were empty. She went to the sheriff's office, but it was locked. She asked around, but no one had seen Jed. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Sarah's heart sank. She knew then that Jed wasn't coming back. Not this time. Returning to the farm in the early hours, defeated and exhausted, Sarah went to the pantry to make herself some coffee. The bin where they kept the flour was empty. That's strange, she thought. I just bought a sack last week. She checked the sugar jar, also empty. A growing sense of dread began to creep over her. She rushed to the storage shed, where they kept the dried meat and vegetables for the winter. The door creaked open, revealing bare shelves. Everything was gone. Even the tools Jed had promised to sell were missing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, her legs weak. It was then she understood. Jed hadn't just left. He had stolen from her. He had taken everything they had, leaving her with nothing. The hope she had felt, the belief that he could change, shattered into a million pieces. She felt a pain deeper than any she had ever known. It wasn't just the loss of the supplies, it was the betrayal. She sank to the ground, tears streaming down her face. She was alone, penniless, and with winter just around the corner. How would she survive? The chickens wouldn't lay eggs forever, and the garden was almost bare. She had no money to buy more seeds, no way to hunt for food. As the sun rose, casting a harsh light on the empty shed, Sarah knew she was in serious trouble. Jed hadn't just abandoned her. He had left her to die. She had to find a way to survive, but she had no idea where to start. The vast, unforgiving landscape seemed to mock her despair. As if things weren't bad enough, the sky turned an angry gray the next day. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and dark clouds gathered overhead. Sarah knew a storm was coming, as she braced herself for the worst. She tried to secure the loose boards on the barn and bring the chickens inside, but the wind was too strong. The storm hit with a fury. Rain lashed down in sheets, and the wind ripped through the farm, tearing at everything in its path. The old oak tree near the house groaned and swayed, its branches thrashing wildly. Sarah huddled inside, watching the storm rage outside her window. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the house. Sarah ran to the window and saw that the old oak tree had fallen, crashing onto the roof of the barn. Part of the roof had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole. The chickens squawked in terror as the rain poured in. The storm raged for hours. Sarah stayed awake all night, listening to the wind and the rain. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, but the damage was done. The barn was badly damaged, the garden was flooded, and the fence was broken. The farm looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Sarah surveyed the damage with a heavy heart. She knew she had to repair the barn before winter set in, but she had no tools and no strength. The storm had not only damaged her farm, it had also crushed her spirit. She felt more alone and helpless than ever before. The storm had isolated her even further, cutting her off from any hope of rescue. Despite her despair, Sarah knew she couldn't give up. She had to try to fix the barn, even if it seemed impossible. She found a few old planks of wood that hadn't been taken and started to drag them toward the barn. They were heavy, and her arms ached, but she kept going. As she was trying to prop up a large piece of wood against the damaged roof, the ground gave way beneath her feet. She lost her balance and fell, landing hard on a pile of broken branches. A sharp pain shot through her leg. She tried to get up, but she couldn't put any weight on her leg. She looked down and saw that her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. Tears welled up in her eyes. Not only was she alone and without supplies, but now she was injured. She managed to crawl back to the house, her leg throbbing with pain. She knew she needed to set the ankle, but she had no idea how. She had seen Jed do it once, but she couldn't remember the details. She tried to splint it with some sticks and rags, but it was no use. The pain was too intense. She lay on her bed, shivering with cold and pain. She knew she was in trouble. With her injured leg, she couldn't hunt, she couldn't gather firewood, and she couldn't even reach the well for water. She was trapped, helpless, and slowly running out of time. The winter was coming, and she was utterly unprepared. Her hope dwindled with each passing hour. Days blurred into one another. Sarah's food supply dwindled to almost nothing. She rationed the last of the dried beans, eating only a handful each day. The pain in her ankle throbbed constantly, making it difficult to sleep. She was weak from hunger and dehydration. The nights were the worst. The cold seeped into the house, chilling her to the bone. She wrapped herself in blankets, but it wasn't enough. She shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Loneliness pressed down on her like a heavy weight. She missed Jed, even though she knew he had betrayed her. She missed his warmth and his strength. She tried to stay positive, but it was hard. She told herself that someone would come looking for her, that someone would notice she was gone. But deep down, she knew that no one cared. She was just the outlaw's wife, and out in the Wild West, life was cheap. Her only companions were the chickens, who pecked around the yard, searching for scraps of food. She felt sorry for them. They were hungry too. She managed to crawl to the chicken coop and give them the last of her grain. As each day passed, Sarah grew weaker and more despondent. She started to lose hope. She imagined herself lying there, alone and forgotten, until the winter snows covered her body. The thought terrified her, but she didn't have the strength to fight it. She closed her eyes and waited, praying for a miracle. But miracles, she knew, were rare in the Wild West. The fever took hold of Sarah, making her head spin and her body burn. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her dreams filled with strange and frightening images. She saw shadowy figures lurking outside her window and heard whispers carried on the wind. One moment, she was back in her childhood home, playing with her sisters in the sunshine. The next, she was lost in a dark forest, surrounded by wolves with glowing eyes. But the most vivid hallucination was of Jed. She saw him standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes filled with remorse. "Sarah," he said, his voice a mere whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Sarah reached out to him, her fingers trembling. "Jed, is that really you?" He nodded, his face etched with pain. "I made a mistake, Sarah. A terrible mistake. Can you ever forgive me?" Sarah wanted to believe him, but she knew it wasn't real. It was just a trick of her mind, a cruel illusion conjured up by fever and desperation. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the image of his face. But he wouldn't go away. He was there when she woke up, sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. He brought her water and food, whispering words of comfort. Sarah knew it was all a dream, but she couldn't resist the comfort it provided. In her fevered state, she started to talk to him, telling him all her fears and regrets. She confessed that she still loved him, despite everything he had done, and she begged him to stay with her, to never leave her alone again. The hallucinations became her only solace, a brief escape from the harsh reality of her situation. But even in her delirium, she knew it couldn't last. Soon, the fever would consume her entirely, and she would be lost forever. On the edge of her awareness, between fever dreams and waking nightmares, Sarah thought she saw something move on the horizon. It was just a small speck at first, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. She blinked, wondering if it was another hallucination, but didn't disappear. As the speck grew larger, she could make out the shape of a horse and rider. A lone figure, slowly approaching her farm. Hope flickered within her, a tiny spark in the darkness. Could this be the miracle she had been praying for? Or was it just another cruel trick of fate? The rider was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and a weathered face. He wore a dusty brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. As he drew closer, Sarah could see that he carried a rifle across his lap. He stopped his horse a short distance from the house, his gaze sweeping over the damaged farm. He seemed cautious, wary. Sarah tried to call out to him, but her voice was weak and raspy. All that came out was a faint whisper. The stranger dismounted and slowly approached the house, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. He paused at the porch, his eyes scanning the windows. He called out, his voice deep and resonant. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Sarah gathered all her remaining strength and called out again. "Help, please." The stranger heard her this time. He moved quickly, kicking open the door and stepping inside. Sarah watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. He was here. Someone had finally come. His name, she would soon learn, was Caleb, and he might be her only hope. Caleb wasn't just wandering aimlessly. He'd seen the smoke from a small fire days ago, a sign of life in this desolate territory. But the West taught a man to be wary. Approaching any homestead could mean facing desperate people, outlaws, or worse. The dilapidated state of the farm only heightened his caution. The broken fence, the collapsed barn roof, the overgrown weeds, it all spoke of hardship and neglect. He'd heard whispers in town about Jed, the outlaw who had settled somewhere in this area. Caleb didn't want any trouble with outlaws. He had enough problems of his own, but something about the stillness of the place bothered him. A bad feeling, a sense of wrongness. He scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of danger. He checked the ground for tracks, trying to determine how many people lived there and when they had last been active. He noticed the tracks of chickens and a few cattle, but nothing recent. As he approached the house, he kept his hand near his gun. He listened carefully for any sound, a dog barking, a child crying, anything. The silence was unnerving. It felt like the farm was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. When he heard Sarah's faint cry for help, his instincts kicked in. He knew he had to act quickly. He kicked open the door, ready for anything. But what he found inside was worse than he could have imagined. A young woman, lying helpless and alone on the brink of death. The outlaw, Jed, was nowhere in sight. And Caleb knew, in that moment, that he couldn't just walk away. He was going to have to help her, whether he wanted to or not. The sight that greeted Caleb was grim. Sarah lay on a small cot, her face pale and gaunt. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. He knelt beside her and gently touched her forehead. It was burning hot. She was unconscious, lost in the grip of a fever. He quickly assessed the situation. The room was sparsely furnished and dirty. There was no sign of food or water. He saw the makeshift splint on her leg and knew she was injured. It was clear she had been alone for a long time and was in desperate need of help. Caleb had seen a lot of suffering in his life, but something about this young woman's plight touched him deeply. He didn't know her, but he couldn't bear to leave her to die. He knew he had to do something, and fast. He started by fetching water from the well, carefully carrying it back to the house. He dampened a cloth and gently wiped her face and neck, trying to bring down her fever. He found a few scraps of wood and started a small fire in the hearth, hoping to warm the room. He rummaged through his saddlebags, searching for anything that might help. He found a small pouch of dried meat and a flask of water. He knew it wasn't much, but it was a start. He gently pried open Sarah's mouth and trickled a few drops of water onto her tongue. He knew that saving her would be a long and difficult process. She was weak and injured, and he was just one man. But he was determined to do everything he could to give her a fighting chance. He settled in for the night, watching over her and praying for a miracle. The outlaw Jed was forgotten. All that mattered was saving Sarah's life. The next few days were a blur of feverish dreams and whispered conversations. Caleb stayed by Sarah's side, nursing her with a patience and gentleness that surprised even him. He carefully rationed his limited supplies, making sure she had enough water and broth to keep her strength up. He hunted small game, sharing what little meat he could get with her. He knew it wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He also foraged for edible plants, remembering what his grandmother had taught him about the land. He cleaned and resplinted her ankle, doing his best to set it properly. He knew it would take time to heal, but he hoped he could at least ease her pain. He talked to her, even when she was unconscious, telling her stories about his life and trying to reassure her that everything would be all right. Slowly, gradually, Sarah began to improve. Her fever started to break, and she began to regain consciousness. At first, she was confused and disoriented, not knowing where she was or who Caleb was. But as her mind cleared, she began to remember everything that had happened. She was grateful for Caleb's kindness and care. She knew that he had saved her life. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just a stranger, but a savior. She started to trust him, sharing her fears and her hopes. And she began to wonder if, maybe, there was a reason he had come into her life. Perhaps, after all the bad things that had happened, something good was finally about to begin. But the shadow of Jed still loomed large, a reminder of the danger that still lurked in the west. As Sarah regained her strength, she started to talk more. She told Caleb about her life on the farm, about the hard work and the loneliness. She told him about Jed, her outlaw husband, and the fear and shame she had lived with. She explained how he had promised to change, and how she had dared to believe him. She confessed how he had disappeared, taking everything with him and leaving her to die. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, and Caleb listened patiently, offering words of comfort and support. He didn't judge her or condemn Jed. He simply listened, allowing her to unburden herself. Sarah was amazed by Caleb's kindness and understanding. She had never met anyone like him before. He was quiet and reserved, but he had a gentle heart and a strong sense of justice. She felt safe with him, protected. She asked him why he had come to her farm, why he had risked his life to save her. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then said, "I just couldn't leave you there to die. It wasn't right." Sarah knew there was more to it than that. She could see it in his eyes. He was running from something, hiding from something. She didn't press him, but she knew that one day he would tell her his story. As she recovered, Sarah started to help Caleb with the chores around the farm. She couldn't do much with her injured ankle, but she could tend to the chickens and help with the cooking. They worked together, side by side, building a bond of trust and friendship. But the knowledge of Jed's past and the possibility of his return still cast a shadow over their newfound peace. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah finally asked Caleb about his past. "You saved my life, Caleb," she said. "I know you didn't have to. Why did you do it?" Caleb looked into the flames, his face troubled. "I'm not a hero, Sarah," he said. "I'm just a man running from his own mistakes." He hesitated, then began to speak. He told her about a bad decision he had made years ago, a decision that had cost him everything. He didn't go into details, but Sarah could tell it was something that haunted him still. "I ran away," he said. "I left everything behind, hoping to start over. But you can't outrun your past, Sarah. It always catches up with you." Sarah listened intently, her heart aching for him. She knew what it was like to be haunted by the past. "But you helped me," she said. "You didn't have to, but you did. That makes you a good person, Caleb." Caleb shook his head. "I don't know about that," he said. "But I do know that I want to help you. I want to help you rebuild your life. You deserve a second chance, Sarah. We both do." He looked at her, his eyes filled with sincerity. Sarah believed him. She knew that Caleb was telling the truth. He was running from his past, but he was also trying to make amends. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Sarah reached out and took Caleb's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." From that moment on, their bond deepened. They were no longer just strangers or even just friends. They were partners, united by their shared past and their hope for the future. But the threat of Jed's return still hung over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. The fragile peace they had built was shattered one afternoon when a group of riders appeared on the horizon. They were rough-looking men, dressed in worn leather and armed to the teeth. They rode hard, their faces grim and determined. Caleb recognized them instantly. He had seen their kind before. They were outlaws, the kind of men who preyed on the weak and defenseless. And he knew, with a sinking feeling, that they were looking for Jed. "Trouble's coming," he said to Sarah, his voice low and urgent. Jed's past has caught up with us. Sarah's face paled. She knew who they were. Jed had told her stories about his old gang, stories she had tried to forget. She knew they were dangerous men, capable of anything. The gang members rode up to the house, their horses kicking up dust. Their leader, a burly man with a scarred face, dismounted and approached the porch. "Where's Jed?" he demanded, his voice rough and menacing. "We know he's here, and we know he's got our loot." Sarah shook her head, her voice trembling. "He's gone," she said. "He left weeks ago. I don't know where he is." The gang leader sneered. "Don't lie to me, woman," he said. "We know he's hiding something, and we're going to find it." He gestured to his men, and they spread out, searching the farm. Caleb knew they had to protect themselves. He grabbed his rifle and pulled Sarah behind him. "Stay close," he said. "This is going to get ugly." The gang had arrived to reclaim what they believed was theirs, and Sarah and Caleb were caught in the crossfire. Knowing they were outgunned, Caleb decided their best chance was to hide. "We need to get out of here," he whispered to Sarah, carefully guiding her toward the back of the house. "There's a root cellar under the floorboards in the kitchen. It's our only hope." Sarah, despite her injured ankle, moved as quickly as she could, her heart pounding with fear. They slipped into the kitchen, just as the gang members began to ransack the house. Caleb quickly pulled up the loose floorboards, revealing the dark, musty cellar below. "Help me down," Sarah said, gritting her teeth against the pain in her ankle. Caleb gently lowered her into the cellar, then followed after her, carefully replacing the floorboards above them. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the gang members tearing apart the house above them. They could hear them shouting and cursing, smashing furniture and throwing things around. "They're going to find us," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Not if we're quiet," Caleb replied, his voice calm and reassuring. "They won't think to look down here." They waited in silence, holding their breath, as the gang members continued their search. The air in the cellar was thick and stale, and the darkness was oppressive. But they knew they had to stay hidden, no matter what. After what seemed like an eternity, the sounds above them began to fade. The gang members had given up searching the house, and were now searching the barn and the surrounding area. Caleb knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, the gang would find them. But for now, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. He started to formulate a plan, knowing they couldn't just wait to be found. They had to outsmart these outlaws. When Caleb was sure the gang was far enough away from the house, he carefully lifted the floorboards and climbed out of the cellar. He helped Sarah up, then whispered they'll be back. "We need to be ready." He knew they couldn't outrun the gang on horseback, not with Sarah's injured ankle. Their only chance was to use the terrain to their advantage. He led Sarah to a rocky outcrop behind the barn, where they could hide and have a clear view of the surrounding area. "Stay here," he said. "If they come back, fire a warning shot." "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. The gang leader turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" he demanded. "And what are you doing here?" "I'm just a traveler," Caleb replied. "Passing through. I haven't seen anyone around here except for the woman who lives on this farm." The gang leader sneered. "Don't play coy with me," he said. "We know Jed is around here somewhere, and we know he's got our money." "I haven't seen Jed," Caleb said, telling the truth. "And I don't know anything about any money." The gang leader stepped closer, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. "You're lying," he said. "I can see it in your eyes. You're protecting him." "I'm not protecting anyone," Caleb said. "I'm just trying to stay out of trouble." The tension between them was thick and palpable. Both men knew that a single wrong word could spark a deadly confrontation. The standoff had begun. Caleb knew he couldn't win in a straight gunfight. The gang leader had more men and more guns. But Caleb had something the gang didn't: knowledge of the land. He had spent years traveling through the West, learning its secrets and its dangers. He knew every hidden path, every treacherous ravine, every deceptive mirage. He decided to use that knowledge to his advantage. He started by leading the gang leader away from the farm, deeper into the wilderness. He knew that Sarah was watching from the rocky outcrop, ready to fire a warning shot if things got too dangerous. As they rode, Caleb pointed out false trails and misleading landmarks, subtly disorienting the gang leader. In the confusion, Caleb spurred his horse forward, riding through a narrow gap in the rocks. He knew that the gang leader couldn't follow him. The gap was too narrow for a horse to pass through. Caleb had outsmarted the gang. For now, he knew they wouldn't give up easily, but he had bought Sarah some time, and that was all that mattered. He had to get back to her and protect her from the storm that was coming. Caleb raced back to the farm, knowing the gang wouldn't be far behind. He found Sarah still at the rocky outcrop, her face pale with worry. "They're coming," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to be ready." He quickly formulated a plan. He knew they couldn't fight the entire gang, but they could set a trap. He used his knowledge of the land to create a series of obstacles and ambushes, hoping to slow the gang down and give them a fighting chance. When the gang arrived, they were met with a hail of gunfire. Caleb and Sarah, working together, picked off the gang members one by one, using their wits and their courage to defend their home. Sarah, despite her injured ankle, proved to be a crack shot. She had learned to shoot from her father, and she wasn't afraid to use her skills to protect herself and Caleb. The fighting was fierce and brutal, but Caleb and Sarah refused to give up. They fought with a determination they never knew they possessed. They were fighting for their lives and for their future. Finally, after hours of relentless fighting, the last of the gang members fell. The farm was silent, except for the sound of their ragged breathing. They had won. Against all odds, they had defeated the gang. Sarah was finally safe. The threat of Jed's past was gone, washed away in a storm of gunfire and courage. They looked at each other, their faces streaked with dirt and blood. They had been through hell together, and they had emerged stronger than ever. They knew that they could face anything as long as they had each other. The bond that had formed between them was unbreakable. They were ready to start a new life together. With the gang gone, a sense of peace settled over the farm. The damage was extensive, but their spirits were high. They knew they could rebuild together. "What do you say, Sarah?" Caleb asked, looking at her with a hopeful smile. "Do you want to stay here? Do you want to rebuild this place? With me?" Sarah looked around at the farm, at the broken barn, at the flooded garden, at the bullet-riddled house. It was a mess, but it was her mess, and it was where she belonged. She looked at Caleb, her heart filled with gratitude and affection. He had saved her life, and he had given her a reason to hope again. She knew that she could trust him, that she could rely on him. "Yes, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I want to stay. I want to rebuild this place. With you." They set to work immediately. They started by repairing the barn, mending the roof, and reinforcing the walls. Caleb used his carpentry skills to build new furniture and fix the damaged windows. Sarah tended to the garden, planting new seeds and nurturing the soil. They worked tirelessly, side by side, their efforts fueled by their shared dream of a better future. Slowly, gradually, the farm began to come back to life. The chickens started laying eggs again, and the garden,